Welcome to Future Talk. This is the program that examines the global impact of technology, both the promises and the perils, and tries to see just where the new technology is leading us. On today's program, we're going to talk about the future of journalism. The growth of the internet has changed all the traditional models of journalism and forced us to come up with new paradigms of how journalists and journalistic organizations will have to operate in the future. I have two guests who have been deeply involved in the evolution of the new journalism. David Nordfors is co-founder and executive director of the Center for Innovation Journalism at Stanford University. He's a member of the Futures Committee of the Tech Museum of Innovation, a member of the World Economic Forum Global Agenda Council on the Future of Journalism, and he holds a PhD in molecular quantum physics from Uppsala University in Sweden. Tony Deifell is the director of Q Media Labs, which examines how technology, media, and business shape society. He was the founder of the Institute for Public Media Arts, which promoted user-generated content before there was a name for it, and his work received recognition by the White House as a national model for diversity education. He's also the author of The Big Thaw, a highly detailed study of the evolution of independent media as influenced by the new technology. We'll be getting to our discussion in just a few minutes, but first we have a video from public broadcasting station WTIU in Indiana showing the impact that the internet has already had upon journalism. Let's roll that tape.
According to the Internet World Statistics in 2008, globally over 413 million people use the Internet, and the number is expected to increase this year. The FCC has faced many challenges trying to regulate the Internet.
The Internet is virtually a free-for-all, and the reason for that, it seems to me, is, first of all, the Internet is inherently chaotic and very, very difficult to control. Whereas a broadcast station, I mean, if a television licensee does something very, very wrong, the FCC can pull that license, and that broadcaster can no longer operate. That's hard to do on the Internet.
The Internet has become the primary source for information for everyone. The immediate access allows people to stay informed through technology with new forms of media, such as Twitter or Facebook, which Mark Doiza, associate professor in the Department of Telecommunications at Indiana University, explains why Internet usage is common across age, gender, and class.
In the recent unrest in Iran in the elections, when we heard the reports that the real information out of Iran was coming from Twitter and similar sort of online networks, and not from mainstream media that were censored or ejected from the country. I mean, that's a big, powerful statement to the capacity of individual human beings to inform each other and themselves. Empowered by the tools that the Internet provides.
Technological advancements are providing more opportunities for immediacy and creativity in various forms of news presentation. Innovative combinations of audio, video, and text are forcing older versions of media to explore new business models.
Newspapers and news collectors and presenters are going to have to shift their focus, taking advantage of the Internet. I don't think newspapers can afford any longer to give away their content. So I think we're going to see some different business models. We're going to see more paid content on the Internet. I think that's one big shift that you're going to see.
Doiza explains that journalists should adopt a new model in order to be effective, and technology is a part of that process.
The entire history of media tells us is that when people have the chance, the tools to tell their own story, that's what they instantly do. They are to be an audience and wait until a journalist tells you what's important and what you need to know is actually very unnatural. I think when journalism realizes that and accepts that its role as a mass medium that tells people what they need to know is over, I think that's when we begin to see solutions to a new role for them in the 21st century.
So, David, the Internet has already had a huge impact on the way journalism is practiced. What further changes can we expect to see in the future?
Well, we've only seen the start, actually. And it's happened very fast, and it's going to go faster and faster. So what we're seeing now is that journalism is approaching real time more than it used to. It's increasing engagement, and it's getting onto our cell phones so that mobility is increasing. So what's going to be added to that now also then is geographical positioning, so that I will be able to get the news on my phone about what's happening around me and be able to interact with it more.
Now, you're the director of an organization called the Center for Innovation Journalism at Stanford. Not innovative journalism, innovation journalism.
Right.
So what's that about?
Well, it's about telling the story about how innovation happens. And it sounds as if it would be something easy that journalism always has done. It's true that journalism always has done it, but it's wrong that it's easy, because innovation is about, it's not about tech or business or politics, but it's about tech and business and politics and how they co-evolve. And usually in traditional journalism, one separates these stories, and we have to learn how to tell them together in order to understand what's happening with music or what we can do about global warming and issues like that.
Is that like horizontal journalism versus vertical journalism?
Yes, I'd say so,
I think we have a
yes.
graphic for that. Do we have that graphic? Well, anyway. So basically what you're saying is that we need a new model of journalism in which a story has more elements and broader reach?
Yes, I think that the journalists need to focus more on how people who do different things and how they kind of come together and how they relate to each other in making new things happen.
Oh,
so that we can discuss how innovation happens, because this is the big driving force in society today. Back in the 80s, economic growth was very much about doing more of the same and managing the products you had. But today, growth and change in society is so much more about replacing old things with new things. So you could maybe do the same thing for 10 years before. You can only do it for 2 years today. So you have to all the time think about what to do next now, and that's new. And that means that we need to have journalism that can report on the process of change much better than what it has been able to do so far.
Tony, you're the head of an organization called Q Media Labs. What do you do there?
Q stands for questions. We ask questions, and so we have a mix of consulting projects and strategy projects. So the big thaw came out of that. Then we have some practitioner lab projects where we put into action experimental projects to get people to do user-generated content. We have a project called Why Do You Do What You Do, which asks people all over the world, why do you do what you do? It's a little bit more of an art project, but the big thaw was a big project we just finished.
Now that's sort of a lengthy report. I looked at some of it, explaining where we are with journalism today and where we might be in the future. Does the name The Big Thaw signify anything? I thought it must.
Yeah, The Big Thaw, the subtitle is Charting a New Course for Journalism. And the big thaw, the metaphor is, actually there's a guy named Clay Shirky who talked about how nobody's all up in arms about the decline of print journalism. It's actually been like watching a glacier 10 miles off and deciding not to move. And so he says this change has been coming for a decade. So anybody that hasn't moved, hasn't changed, it's just sort of like refusing to move when a glacier's coming. But the thing is that when disruptive technology happens, when industries change, it actually takes a decade before people recognize what are the aspects about it that we can adapt our strategy to. So the big thaw of the metaphor is about like the old paradigm of journalism thawing out. Instead of the floodwaters flooding us when it thaws, we can actually use those currents to go to higher ground if we learn how to use the tools in the right way. So I'm fairly optimistic about it. And the report, it's like a 100-page report, but it really pulls together all the different sort of leading thinkers out there and puts it in a framework that's about adapting your strategy and getting the right competencies and figuring out the right business models for it.
Well, just with the technology, the fact that information can be transmitted so quickly in such large quantities from anywhere to anywhere. I mean, that's a major game changer in itself. Does this mean that media is going to be a lot more decentralized, or is it still going to be dominated by a handful of big media players?
I think it'll be a little bit of both. I mean, building off the video that we saw earlier, the whole Iranian conflict, I think, is a great sort of signal of how media is going to go in the future. And that is that there were people firsthand on the ground that were reporting and getting pictures of conflict, circumventing the government, circumventing mainstream media, but yet it was hard for users to separate the noise from what's relevant and reliable. And I think we'll in the future, we'll constantly have that struggle between separating things that are first-hand accounts that are authentic and things that feel like noise. But I think there are curators. Journalists, I think, will become less educators and more facilitators. There'll be these curators of the best stuff that's coming from Twitter, and then there'll be ones that almost like a Socratic teacher. They'll ask the right questions and they'll build communities, not just impart knowledge. They'll be able to lift out knowledge from a community.
I think this is, the key, that it used to be that media and journalism were synonyms. They are not synonyms anymore. It used to be that the guys who provided the stories were the guys who provided the medium, and you bundled that. So the product was the story and the distribution mechanism for the story. And what's happening now is that you're getting a new category of media companies that provide the medium. And this is everything from telecom operators to Facebook, Twitter. And then the journalists, the storytellers, they become independent players in this. Now, so they move away from being the gatekeepers, and everybody can find information everywhere. But I also subscribe to that we will have some big players, because I think that attention is gravitational. Attention attracts attention. So if 50% of the world's population will watch some show, the other 50% will watch too, just to see what the first 50% are watching. Now, I think the audience will be a bit more mobile than it has been, but we will definitely have that. But then we will also have this tail.
Well, I actually think the attention will still, even though there'll be some big winners and big companies, the attention will ultimately be still very much more distributed. So, like if you looked at television networks in the 1970s compared to the top-rated television show today, and you took the total number of viewers, it'll have less than the total number of viewers from the 15 top television shows in the 70s. That's because people have so much they're paying attention to on so many devices. In fact, I agree with you. I think like users want any information, anytime, on any platform, on any device. Like they want that freedom. So they won't just go to one source anymore. They won't just go to the New York Times. If you sent me something from a magazine I'd never heard of before, and you said, hey, this is really interesting because of this, and I knew it came from you, I would totally read it, and I would trust it because of that.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. But I think also that we should also realize that we're coming to the time which is probably the first time since the creation of the universe that we are able to point the attention of all human beings on the same story at the same time globally. We have not been able to do that before. And as we sort of approach real-time reporting, that's going to happen. So that's of course going to lead to some very interesting effects in society, because if we think that we until now have had problems with bubbles and hype and stuff, I mean, wait until everybody on Earth is going to put their attention at the same time, and if it now is some terror attack somewhere, or if it is some game show somewhere.
Or Tiger Woods.
Right now,
yes, Tiger Woods.
There's actually a huge amount of data out there, and there's a lot of grassroots media organizations. In fact, we have a video from an organization called theuptake.org showing how a small group of people, all of them volunteers with no real resources, were able to have an effect in the 2008 election campaign. Let's go ahead and roll that tape.
Hard to tell what that was, but it blew up. I don't know if you could see it from there. Wow.
You may have caught the Uptake's live coverage of the Republican National Convention. We seemed to have cameras wherever the action was and were reporting what was happening hours, if not days, before the legacy media.
And the gassing has started. And we have running.
So how did the Uptake, a nonprofit that operates on a shoestring budget based on the kindness of donors, manage to outdo the multi-million-dollar corporations? Simple. Train, organize, and crowdsource.
I can totally help you with this.
We discovered people learn the most when we do hands-on, one-on-one sessions to cover the basics.
I plug in the microphone, I turn on the camera, I point, I shoot, and suddenly I'm telling my own story.
Okay, now you've got a bunch of people who know how to run a camera and are ready to go out and cover news. So what do you do next? Well, you got to organize. And we do that the same way that we organize a political campaign. We turn to free services available on the web to keep track of volunteers, story ideas, events, and of course equipment. We didn't have our own equipment to start with, so we created a database of tripods, cameras, microphones, and so on that our volunteers owned and were willing to lend out. We also let people submit story ideas to our website. Organizing volunteers was integral to our marathon coverage of Minnesota's U.S. Senate recount and election contest trial.
The ballots are missing.
The Uptake was the only media to cover every minute of this, and thousands around the world watched daily for several months. Organizing can be as low-tech as listing what to cover here on a piece of paper and then asking people to go out and cover it with a camera. Or you can go high-tech. Using Cover It Live and Twitter during live events, we're able to let our audience help us with the reporting. The timestamp on both services helps us locate important snippets of videos out of the hours we record, allowing our volunteers to quickly edit clips that are interesting. Using a free service called TubeMogul, we can publish these clips to YouTube, Blip, and more than a dozen other video sites in a matter of minutes. During the RNC, we used crowdsourcing on Twitter to track where news was happening by searching for the RNC hashtag or following particular people's tweets. Since our volunteers were dispersed all over downtown St. Paul, we could have someone on the scene in minutes, and thanks to a free service called Quick, we were able to stream live video of the event as it happened. We still sent people out with regular tape cameras, and they came back with compelling video that we quickly captured, edited, and distributed for the whole world to see. The Uptake, a shoestring volunteer operation, was able to do all this not only because the technology was easy and affordable, but because we were able to organize.
So, David, do you think this is a significant part of the future of journalism? The citizen journalist who doesn't get paid, he just goes where he thinks there's a story, maybe collaborating with some other people, and gets something out there that can be seen by the whole world if they have internet access.
I think it is significant, but I don't think it's the only part. I think what we see here is sort of what our friend Doug Engelbart would call collective intelligence, and our ability to focus collective attention on something. But then there's also, it's not only the sensing things, it's also the perception part and interpreting what you get in. And I think one thing that we need to address in citizen journalism is, of course, what are the credentials of the citizen journalist, and who do we know, or how do we know who the citizen journalist represents when they do the story?
Well, it's pretty easy if you have a specific political viewpoint or political agenda. It's pretty easy to create a story that seems to support that agenda.
Yes.
So. Good.
I think in the past, like when you think about independent journalism versus mainstream journalism by bigger corporations, the independent journalists tried to affect mainstream. It would be trying to get a story picked up by mainstream media, and now actually can work around that. And then if they're there and they're live and they're getting like the Frank and Coleman debates, CNN will pick it up. They ended up being a source for CNN but it was because they have, like, I think during the recount they had 40,000 people tuned in live to their website. That's not a whole lot, but that's significant enough. And then CNN was like, we can't afford to send people to these things, and they're getting it live. So I think instead of just trying to fight mainstream media and get them to pay attention to stories, they can actually just go around it.
Well, it's also a question of where do we draw the line between activism and journalism? And I think that this is, we can say where the line goes between journalism and PR, but I think it's going to be more difficult to say where the line is going between activism and journalism.
See, I think this brings up a really interesting thing is, and we were talking earlier before we started taping about a guy from the Washington Post who was talking about declarative journalism being one of the future trends, and that is that journalism in the past, the ethics were to be objective as they can, like objectivity is a relative thing, but that was the ethics, to try to be objective, to try to balance things. But now, since there's so many points of view out there, to be declarative with your point of view, but explain where you're coming from, so you're not like, it's about being like transparent. And so I think a lot of, like you see Lube Dobbs, who was on CNN, he had a very strong point of view. Either people hated him or they loved him, but he had a big following. And if you have a pluralistic set of media companies that all have strong points of view, it all ends up balancing out, I think, there. So I think in the future people become more declarative, more point of view oriented, and it'll sort of sort itself out in the diversity.
Yeah, I think the whole sort of objective thing is problematic because, and it always was actually, in physics there's something they call the time paradox that's very esoteric and has to do with theory of relativity, and we won't go into it. But there's a joke version of it that actually is very true. It goes like this, that if you have a watch, you know what the time is, but if you have two, you're uncertain. Mm-hmm. And I think that this is what's happening, that when people have had one local newspaper or very few news sources, that has been the point of reference.
Does the new technology create any kind of philosophical change in the way journalism is done? Is it just new tools, or do the new tools create a new mindset? And if so, what is that mindset?
Well, I think it changes the definition because in the old days, up until a few years ago, when the story and the medium was bundled, journalism was defined by its relation to the medium. If you go to Oxford Learner's Dictionary, it says a journalist is somebody who prepares news and features for newspapers or broadcast. And of course, this is not relevant anymore. So we have to redefine journalism so that it isn't defined in terms of its relation to the medium, but in terms of its relation to the audience.
Well, what is the role of the journalist? Is that itself going to change? I mean, there's nothing in the laws that define a specific role for a journalist. He's sort of an independent person, but he nevertheless plays an important role in informing people.
I would suggest that we think of journalists as people who prepare news and features focusing public attention on issues that interest the public with the mandate from the audience. And if they do it with the mandate from the sources, then they're PR guys. Mm-hmm. But if they do it with a mandate from the audience, then they're journalists. So their job is just to put attention to things that are of interest for the public. I think that's a usable definition in the future.
And I would add to that, when I said before it's about facilitating, I think it's about involving the audience in some way. And some of that can be crowdsourcing, some of it could be letting a story unfold, because you don't pre-package stories anymore that you have to like write it up and has to have a beginning and end and all that sort of stuff, and then it goes to print and then it goes out. Like, it unfolds real time. And so journalists, I think, are in a position of sort of not being the experts to pre-package it, but they sort of have to know the questions to ask, they know how to respond to stuff. So I think the role shifts, and they can't cover everything. I mean, it's covered on Twitter and online. You just can't, the role to have to cover a beat anymore, I think, is old school.
But it is still very important. I mean, since we will continue to live in societies that take collective decisions, and we want to know what to do with our tax bucks and so on, we still need to be able to facilitate public discussion. And this, I think, is the job of journalists. And they need to have the right set of incentives and business models so that they earn by doing that in a quality way.
Now, if we talk about catering to the audience seems very interested in celebrity scandals, as opposed to, say, the healthcare issue, which is extremely important, but which is also excruciatingly tedious much of the time. In the new journalism, you still can't force feed people to take things that they're not interested in, even if it's important to them. What do we do about that?
Well, I think that is a question of better storytelling, and I think that there are lots of issues that journalists have earlier said, that doesn't interest the audience, and it turns out that it's extremely interesting for the audience. I remember the days when technology wasn't interesting for the audience, and when we started with information technology, and journalists said, "What, you can't do stories on information technology? Nobody's interested in that." And people love it, and people want to read the news about the latest phones and so on. Many political journalists think that that's trivial because it's gadgets, but it's not. It's the tools that are changing our lives, and people do care.
So if we explain stories simply enough, in terms that people understand easily, they might be a lot more popular, because the average news story is about a minute, typically.
If it's, one of the things about technology and how it's affecting, I think, the production of news. There was this guy that did a study of Nietzsche, and how when Nietzsche went from writing longhand to writing with a typewriter, how his rhetoric and all the language he used went from arguments to aphorisms. And it does a whole analysis of just the tool that he was using and how his writing changed. And I think when you look at 140 characters with Twitter and things like that, journalists are having to change the way they write and the way they think and the way they analyze stuff, as well as we're changing sort of how we consume things. So I think that's going to be a big thing.
I think people are getting a bit tired of all the time being made depressed. And it's important that we learn about the problems, but it's also a problem that we learn about how we can solve problems. And this, I think, is why what started as consumer journalism and gadget journalism has turned out to be very, very popular, because it's about actually journalism for us telling us, here come new tools that you can solve problems with. And people want to have that. So I think it's important for journalism to focus both on the problems and the solutions and enable people to solve problems.
Now, I'd love to continue this conversation. We have a lot more things to talk about. Unfortunately, we're just about out of time, so we are going to have to wrap the show. I'd like to thank my two distinguished guests, David Nordfors and Tony Deifell. Thank you very much to both of you for being here today. Please visit our website at www.futuretalk.net. Thank you for watching. Be sure to tune in next time. I'm Marty Wasserman. See you next time.